Sue made a comment about being soldiers and what that meant, what the definition was. Can you all hear me okay? Would you rather I use the mic?
We can hear you.
You can hear okay. Do you want me to tone it down so you can't just a little bit? All right. Outstanding. And what happens is in December 18th, 1969, I took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I mention that pledge as a beginning of this for a couple of reasons. Jim, he uses that word, he's a history buff more than anything else. He's probably one of the smartest people that I've met. His concept and understanding of liberty is second to none. What I bring to the table on this tonight is I'd like to frame the issue about property taxes, about pension, but we're going to focus on pension. And then with that, then automatically, by default, almost becomes the property tax issue. But one of the things that happens, and one of the reasons that Jim and I were teasing each other about economics, is that the way the system works is geared almost to confuse people. And Bob, thank you for being here. Bob Phillips is here, one of our county commissioners. And I mean that. Thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate that. But let me, and I didn't know Bob was going to be here, and I planned on saying this before this happened. If you remember in the primary, a comment came out, Ryan supports people who gave 80% tax increase. Anybody get that flyer? What I said was, and it segues right into this. What I said was, I understand why it happens. Because there are things that's called the cost driver, and I write about this in the book. And by the way, if you can't sleep, get it, you'll be out in a couple minutes. And what happens is that the real problem lies at the state level. But the trickle-down effect on the county and the boroughs is unbelievable. And I specialize in keeping companies out of bankruptcy, and I've been doing it for 40 years. And out of that 40 years, we've had about 250 companies, and only 3 have ever gone into bankruptcy. And I say that for a reason. Anytime we find out that there was fraud involved, I will always take it into bankruptcy, because that's how you protect the creditors. And that's the purpose behind doing all that. You protect the workers and the creditors. But in those 247 cases, virtually every one of those companies survived, because you have to solve the right problem. So let me give you an example. And Bob, again, thank you for being here. The county commissioners a number of years ago wanted to alter the county's pension plan and convert it to a defined benefit pension plan. I'm sorry, defined contribution pension plan. But we're not able to because the state law prohibits it. Right. So what happens is the state gives you mandates. I met with Mary Ann Bartley, superintendent of schools in Lebanon. And at first, she said, just to get her ideas and her financial person's ideas and director of special ed's ideas about what was doing it. And I said, Mary Ann, there are certain cost drivers that I know affect you. And she said, give me an example. This is before she agreed to meet. I said, well, as an example, dealing with the needs of children with disabilities is a #1 cost driver. And she sat back and she just looked at me and I said, and then the pension. The sum of those 2 items is about 50% of the school's budget. One is an unfunded mandate from the federal government, taking care of children with disabilities, which needs to be done. I'm not questioning that, so you're aware. For those of you that don't know me, I run a school as a volunteer that takes care of children with severe emotional and behavioral problems and developmental disabilities. So this is important to me. It means if you're going to mandate it, fund it. So what the intent is to pass a tax increase at the federal level, but not pass the tax, the unbalanced, balanced budget that Jim referenced at the state level, that can only get made up by putting it back in the only place it can come from, which is property taxes. And what unfortunately that does is it makes all of us attack one another and keeps us all away from what the real issue is unfunded mandates and a government that's run amok. You know, I started making the comment that I took an oath of office to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I did not take an oath of office to support the government. I took an oath of office to support the Constitution. And I have a responsibility, and I'm angry at my fellow officers that forget that. When I saw Comey speak the other day, I thought we are going to have an Elliot Richardson moment when he's going to say, I was directed to not indict and I am resigning. And he lost his moment in history. He basically said it was an indictable offense, but let's pass on it. And the same thing happens with this idea of pension. We've been able to successfully, and I don't mean we, us, we as a government, successfully do something at the state level that pits us against our local leaders who are really reacting to something over which they have absolutely no control. So here's what Marianne Bartley said to me. I said, Marianne, one of the things I'm concerned about, when I was going door to door, I met 4 young people in the county, in the 101st District. And I said, they were woefully unprepared for the workforce, and yet unbelievably talented. What's wrong with this issue? He said, Frank, the only way we can balance this budget and keep some semblance of control is to eliminate many of the guidance counselor positions, many of the other positions in the schools that we would like to be able to offer to other people that we can't do. So what I'm going to encourage you to do when we look at this idea about pension reform is I want to talk to you about a cost driver. So let me give you an example. And then I want to talk to you about a potential plan to solve it. When you look at the pension liability, you will hear the number $62 billion, and you are being lied to. If this were a commercial plan, I would have to state that assumed earnings rate at somewhere in the neighborhood of 5.5% to 6%, which would mean the liability would be $110 billion. I've talked to an actuary who's confirmed my number. I've met with the Auditor General, Eugene DePasquale, who concurs and is working with his staff to put that into effect. So when we look at doing certain things at the county level, Bob, one thing that might say that we are now funded, if they lower it to 6%, you won't be. And so what happens is all of that would make a grown person cry. For you to have to know about actuarial tables is sad, right? I can't even pick out a color of a shirt to wear, let alone talk about actuarial tables. My wife just said that's true, by the way. So I appreciate that vote of support, right? As my brother said, Bob said to me one time, he said, Mom, he can't dress for a darn, but he's smart, right? Which is the nicest way of saying I'm really ugly, right? But at least I can use a calculator. But what happens is if you don't know that simple fact that's not so simple, and it's not. I mean, I've got almost 20 years worth of education to get to the point where I'm beginning to understand that. And people, we shouldn't do that to you, but the smoke and mirrors of that are almost fatal to the community because it will have to be paid. At some point in time, the reality of that will come to pass. Right? And so as you start to examine that issue, we have to say, what are some of the potential solutions? One of the things, as the county commissioners found out, you want to make a change, there's a law. It's got to be changed first. If they do that, they're violating laws, and the only way that you can do that is by becoming president. See, okay, a CPA can be funny, right? Right? I can't dress myself, but I can try to be funny. But what happens is that as you look at that $110 billion liability, when you look at the massive infrastructure cost that hasn't been funded, we are at an untenable level in the state. We passed an unbalanced budget, which blows my mind. That will not happen should I be successful in November. what happens is, and I say this sincerely, is that the teachers, is anybody here a teacher? Oh, rats, I was hoping. The teachers here, you have to have compassion for one another as well. They're relying on something that they've been promised. Most of them did nothing wrong. I would say as Jim made the comment about police officers, they did nothing wrong. They're trying to get by. But I was talking to someone yesterday, in deference to him, I won't say who it was, basically said, I'm 68, 67, my wife is 62, can't get Medicare. I'm a city employee. I can't retire because if I do, by the time I'm done paying the Part B medical and the medical care under the Affordable Care Act, I don't have enough money to live on. And that's somebody with a defined benefit pension plan. Now multiply that by every single person who doesn't have that benefit, and what you've got is you've got an unsolvable problem. We've got 2 to 4 years before this collapses. I've been in 7 nations in my life that have collapsed economically. And when it does, it spirals rapidly. Some of it you see is some of the societal distress that we're seeing now. That societal distress is people going after one another because we're all at wit's end in various ways, shape, or form. And so until we solve this problem, what's likely to happen is it will get worse. I will tell you that a group like Black Lives Matter, a group like ISIS, festers in that kind of an environment. When they look at that, the issue about domestic terrorism becomes a bigger deal. So now imagine this. You can't pay your health care bill. You can't pay the school tax bill and the pensions. And now on top of that, you've got the added security costs of protecting your community because somebody did something inappropriate. And just think about this for a second. If you don't believe me, look at an entire federal agency called the TSA occurred because September 11th. We are spending billions and billions of dollars a year due to that one issue that was a very sad day in the history of the United States. All because in the 1980s and 70s, and then once again in the 1990s, we decided to disband the human intelligence gathering capability in the United States, so we didn't have the ability to find out that this was going on. So as you start to look at this thing now about the pension cost, $110 billion. One of the things that we're going to propose is to raise a sum certain of money. I estimate it to be about $26 billion. I've already talked to leaders on the Republican side to ask about that number. There's intrigue after we go through the issue. That would then go into a sinking fund for which the state would then be able to earn the appropriate rate of return that then gives a kickstart to the pension. That's number one. Number two, so the first thing to do is properly state the liability. That one action alone would be able to drop your property taxes by somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20%. Just by taking it off of the local schools. And Bob, the same thing would happen with the municipalities. We intend to try to include the municipalities in on that as well. I've already presented this program to Seth Grove and Scott Wagner. And as soon as I get a chance, Mike Fulmer and I are trying to schedule time. For those of you that don't know, his wife had an issue medically, and so Mike's been working very diligent, but he's been very cooperative. So as you look at that, that's item one. The second thing that you go on to is we would work with the PSEA, SEIU. We'd be working with the NFIB. We'd be working with citizens' patriot groups to sit down and formulate doing two things. One, reducing the actuarial growth rate of future earnings. Right now, in the assumptions, it's assuming it's going to grow, and this is a separate number than the earnings rate, at about 3% per year. If we drop that to 1.5%, and they would have to agree to that. If they agreed to drop that to 1.5%, it means keeps the current benefits where it is, drop it by 1.5%, that would solve an additional $22 billion of the problem. So now you're halfway there. These are all the cost drivers. Then the third issue that would occur is we would then convert going forward to a defined contribution plan. Everyone's using the term 401k. The actual term is 403b. If you don't mind, I'm going to use the name 401k. They're the same thing. One's a school plan, one's that, because I think it means more to most people. And rather than getting technical with IRS code, but if I say 401k, I'm technically wrong. So I'm certain I'll see a flyer about this at some time in my past. He doesn't know what he's talking about, which is true, and it'll probably be coming from Sherry. Sorry about that. I've already been told not to use her name, incidentally. So Sherry, I will not use your name again, sweetheart Sherry. But as you look at that, that would be a significant part of it, and converting that would get us another $20 billion. And then what the plan is Seth Grove and Scott Wagner have introduced bills to reduce state spending by the implementation of a reduction in waste, fraud, and abuse, which would be between $3 billion and $4.5 billion, which would pay off the $26 billion borrowed. Now, I met with a person by the name of Rick Dreyfuss, who had a great point. He said, Frank, these revenue bonds like this never work because after about 3 years, the state feels better. You've solved a good bit of the problem, so let's give another benefit. And he's actually right about that. So what the proposal, and based upon his feedback, what the proposal is to take those funds and sequester them so that you have to get the $4.5 billion in savings per year in order to do it. So I've talked with the Auditor General's office. What we would anticipate doing is performance audits of all state agencies, which are required. But what we would change is that those proposals, the recommendations to fix it, would have to go to the legislature to be passed and approved, and we'd have 90 days to do it, and then it would become mandatory upon the state agency. So let me give you an example. Does anybody here work for the state? Okay. Well, Ray, do you have some people in the state? I'll tell you what, rather than using your name, for the person who raised their hand, disregard that one part, Mario. For the person who raised their hand, do you have some people you work with that are not pulling their weight?
Oh, no.
So apparently integrity is not a big issue in certain parts of state government. No, but the reason I bring it up is pretty much every organization's got that. The problem is you can't fire them, right? Guys, we had that in the military. When I was over in Iraq, I get this guy that shows up, and he was assigned to me, and he said, Colonel Ryan, I've been told to report for you. We've got a very important mission. And I said, okay, great. What's your specialty? And he told me. And I said, well, that's great. He said, sir, should I start writing up my Bronze Star right now? You just checked in. And so he said, I know, sir. He said, but I typically start working on my medals as soon as I start coming in so I can make sure I get them by the time I leave. I said, well, why don't we see how you're doing first? He said, sir, that's not the way we do it in my branch of service. I said, I work with a lot of people from your branch of service, and yeah, it is. And so he said, sir, am I going to have to file a complaint against you? I said, I'm 55 years old. Do you really think I give a damn? Right? You know? And so he looked at me and he made a comment. So I found out as we got to know him, here's what we asked him to do. We said after about 2 weeks, this person was absolutely incompetent. And so what we did is we literally put him in an office and said we wouldn't give him a password into the system. We gave him books to read, and then he could brief us later about what the issues were. But he was that incompetent. But you can't get rid of somebody that is incompetent. I had a young lieutenant when I was a captain. We were in an operation, and he got lost. He was on one of the patrols. So he got angry, and he took his pistol and threw it. Well, they're all accountable. You can't just leave that there. So that my staff sergeant that was with the platoon called me and said, a captain in the Marine Corps is called a skipper. He said, Skipper, here's what he did. And I said, well, you know what the drill is. Is if you lose a weapon, all you just drop in place, and then we come out getting you in the morning, and you try to find it. This was in training, so if it was a combat, we wouldn't do that. We would chalk it up to combat loss. But what happened was, I get back and I wrote a pretty negative fitness report on this guy, which basically said this person is not fit to even be breathing, let alone in the military. And so the general calls me up and he says, I take it you didn't like this guy. And I said, what was your first clue? And he said, Frank, I got to ask you a big favor. I said, yes, sir. He said, when you've written it the way you did, and I was much more professional in my write-up than that. He threw his pistol and he said, if you do that, he will go to the Board for Correction of Naval Records. They will get that fitness report pulled, and we'll be stuck with this guy for 20 years until he kills somebody. And the fact of the matter is, that's the way the system works. Do you agree with me on that? Right? No. You might want to take a 3-second break on this for a second while I go take care of it. Well, thank you. But what happens is that's how we would pay for it, is by implementing these things. Here's why I think that will work this time and it would not have worked before. And this is something you need to be aware of. And I've said this when I was running, but it's very important we all be aware of this. Are you aware that the unfunded liabilities of your community are your personal liability? That $110 billion is yours. Do you know that? And I mean that absolutely. Cornwall Borough, this past cycle, had an 80% tax increase. Right? And what happened was there was a whole series of the Lebanon County earned income tax fraud hit. A whole bunch of other issues hit simultaneously. It had to be paid or the community goes bankrupt, to which you might say, let it go bankrupt, right? Because I heard that. This is the reason why I made the comment that I did. At the county level and the community, the municipal level, that will not work because the county or the borough has to retain bankruptcy counsel. And if the judge believes in their sole and absolute decision, virtually not appealable. Now, it is appealable. I am not an attorney, but I do bankruptcy for a living. If you were to go bankrupt, the judge could say the community's taxes are lower than surrounding areas. I think you can afford it. Here's your property tax to pay it off. Right? I know people from New Jersey who 10 years ago were paying $12,000 a year. They're now paying $30,000 a year in property taxes. So what I want you to be aware of is if you have any equity in your home, it's at risk. I will tell you that I was with a group of CPAs last week on Thursday and Friday. And I said, how many of you are financial planners? Most of them raised their hand. How many of you tell your clients that owning a home is actually a liability? They all raised their hand. We have converted home ownership into a liability because of the bankruptcy code. So you could sit back and say, I don't believe them. Okay, ask the people in Detroit. Ask the people in Cornwall. If the county had pushed back and decided to file bankruptcy, I would encourage you to read the bankruptcy proceedings of 4 counties that went bankrupt in the United States, where the judge ruled that it can be paid for by increasing the income tax and by putting on a higher property tax. And your only option is to walk away from your property. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm not kidding. And I haven't even begun to touch on the regulatory overreach. The regulatory overreach, I got a call from a dear friend. And he said he supported it in the primary. And he said, I got to tell you something. He said, I'm a retired government employee. I said, I got it. I understand. And he said, I need to tell you what happened to my daughter. She decided to sell clothing, right, as help with raising money for a group. So she was required by state law to get a sales tax exemption certificate. I said, right, for non-taxable items. Clothing is not taxable. Right? I said, don't tell me she failed to file the quarterly report for zero. Yep, she got fined $200. So for failure to file a zero report, you got fined $200. And so when you look at that type of issue, the point I want you to be aware of is that the bankruptcy code is what creates this problem. So I get a lot of people who say, we're just going to walk away from the liability. Can't do it. So why would a teachers' union agree to do this? Here's what will happen. As Jim made the comment about with martial law, and in the 7 nations that I've seen that have collapsed, is there will be what's called a seminal event. And I don't know when it's going to happen. I pray to God every day it doesn't happen. But it will. There will be a seminal event. And when that seminal event occurs, you will be stunned at how fast things will move. And so here's what will happen. I suspect that there will be some person somewhere in our community, near and dear to all of our hearts, who gets evicted from their home that will cause us to rise up and riot. And I don't mean riot, but I mean rise up and say, we're not taking it anymore. Unfortunately, if we don't know who the cost drivers are, it'll be a misplaced anger. This is the one time I'm going to tell you to work with your borough, work with your county. And I really didn't know Bob was going to be here tonight, because I would have said this if he wasn't. But the ones that are driving this are Harrisburg. Jim's comment about the vape tax, whether you like vaping or not, I've never smoked a day in my life. But those kinds of things are done in order to get a tax put in such a way to kill the competition. That's the way it's done economically. My expertise in the Marine Corps was economic warfare. That's what we did. We would find a way. And if I were a determined opponent of the United States, what I would do is trip the stock market, drop the funding of the pension, force an increase in the property tax until you riot, and then I don't have to do anything. I've just caused you to riot. That's the way you do it. When we went into One Nation for $72,000, we annihilated their economy in a week. They surrendered within 24 hours. Right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, and if you get a chance to listen to Paul Kengor, Paul's a dear friend of mine. He's on the board with me at Lincoln Institute. Paul is a Reagan expert. And Ronald Reagan engaged in economic warfare. And what they did is they found where were we critically vulnerable, and they attacked it. So you know what made them realize that the Soviet Union was about to collapse? Anybody know? The Yugo. Do you know the most stolen car in the world at that time was the Yugo? They only had 6 different types of keys. So every 6th key worked on a car. That's how they saved money. Right. So when you look at that, they said, so then very shortly thereafter, the comment was, let's build a 600-ship Navy. Do you remember that? The Russians tried to compete, and it collapsed. I was in Poland when it did, and my daughter-in-law and I were talking about this a couple weeks ago. You would stand in line waiting for a loaf of bread, and they would tell you what day the bread was being done. The first 15 or 20 people in line would get it. So when you start to examine those issues, you want to be cognizant that what will happen is somebody somewhere will figure a way to trip it. What I plan on doing is this. I plan on asking, and I'm going to implore you, if you know someone who's willing to say, here's what the system does to me, the property tax. Here's how it's affecting me. We were having a discussion with Sue and Jim the other day, and I made a comment that I said, one of the things I'm concerned about is one of the options might be to put the PIT on retirement income. Do you remember that? And you said, you mean if somebody's got a retirement check from, I think it was GE, right? And it's $50 a month at 3%, that's $1.50. Ladies and gentlemen, $1.50 to people is a lot of money. And so when you look at what's happened, there are people that I saw it door to door. People are angry. I got to, Pat Braden, we call her the general. Pat's the field marshal, my wife's the general. And Bill and I, we all salute her, and she always tells us what to do. And so what happened was we agreed that we'd go to every door, not just the super voters. I think that had a big effect to do. We wrote letters to people about what we're thinking about doing. I'm not afraid to defend anything I'm talking about. And I know some people aren't going to be happy. But what I said to Jeff Griffith, who's a dear friend of mine, I said, Jeff, One of the big problems with it and why I'm running at age 65 is that the person who delivers this message will be hated and vilified. This is not a message that people like. I am not running a popularity contest. I can't. I've got to get elected, but you have to be able to go to Harrisburg and say, here's what's going to happen if you don't do it. I have been stunned. So far, I've been allowed to sit in some caucus meetings already. I've been stunned at how receptive a significant number of reps and state senators have been. I was talking about the book, and Senator Mensch said, we don't have any performance metrics to know whether or not the state's doing well or not. I said, Scott Wagner says, you know what? I just saw a book that somebody wrote today, and he's sitting right next to you about developing those kind of performance metrics. He gave me his card and said, get me a copy of the book. And I said it was $20, but that's another matter. By the way, I'm only kidding. I didn't do that. I'm not that stupid. I might be ugly and I can't dress, but I'm not that stupid. But what happens is that we have to recognize this is serious. Here's what will happen if we do nothing, and more people will lose their homes. Borough taxes have gone up. County taxes have gone up. Pennsylvania Turnpike just announced today, January 1st, it's going up another 6%. State taxes are going up. I don't know many people anywhere in the United States that are seeing their pay going up. You might be getting a 2 to 3% pay raise, but then you're paying that much more in health insurance, so it's a net decrease. And so people are struggling. You know, and I'm going to make one last comment, then I'm going to open up for any comments you have. I came from a really poor family, and I've been very blessed. My mom demanded, well, I lived in inner city Baltimore, and she demanded that we all get, I'm convinced that she was related to Ben Carson's mom. They probably talked on the phone, make him read a book, make him read a book. And so what we've done is I've written one, and I'm going to make her read it when I see her if she doesn't have it, right? And what happens is that if you could see the fear and angst in people's faces when I go door to door, people are scared. People are wondering where they're going, the money's going to come from. And I see something in the paper or somewhere that says, but it's the equivalent of $6 a month per person. $6 a month, if you don't have it, is an unbelievable amount of money. Do that 3 times over, and it's a challenge. So here's what I'm going to suggest you to do. Get active. I give everybody my cell phone. Call. And sit down and say, explain that. I'd rather do it because one of the things that we're starting to run into is time constraints. But don't let this stuff fester. Ask the question. Make sure your anger is properly placed. Because if we don't, we will end up falling into the very trap that they want us to, which is not solve the right problem. This solution is unbelievably straightforward. And here's why it will work. If you know a teacher, ask him if they believe that their pension is in jeopardy. And almost all of them will say yes. What they don't know is to what extent. What will happen is when enough people lose their homes, people will come to the bargaining table. And the problem I have with that is there's no such thing as the loss of one home that I find acceptable. That's just plain wrong and immoral. In the negotiations, in the way I've done it all my life, I've always found that being non-adversarial is the best. So as an example, if you notice when I got attacked in the primary, I will not respond. My faith prohibits it. And I will tell you what happens in this regard. And that doesn't mean I roll over and play dead, although my parish priest keeps telling me to turn the other cheek. And then when I turned around like this, he said, that's not what I meant, you know it. But what happens is that I found that when someone does that, all that's happened is they've made people realize what they are really like. If I rise to that level of angst, I'm inadvertently putting you between a rock and a hard place, because then it's they hate us, look what they're doing. So let me give you an example. Pennsylvania is already 50th out of 50 states for job creation. Right. When I walked across the United States in 2014, one thing I found Most of the Midwestern states have already solved their pension problem. If you look at the governor of Texas, he had 3 terms, 12 years. His pension's about $20,000 a year. That's literally 1/5 of what it is here in Pennsylvania. When you look at the number of former governors in Pennsylvania that live out of state, that ought to bother you. When you look at the number of people who retire from government here and then move out of state, that ought to concern you. So here's what happens. It basically says is people who don't want to leave their community are running into a situation where they almost have to in order to survive. But here's the things that occurs. We are in a competitive environment with all other states. It will eventually implode upon themselves, and at that point in time, I can tell you what happens. And a perfect example is Detroit. In the case of Detroit, they ran out of money again. They came out of bankruptcy 2 years ago. They ran out of money again. The governor had to bail it out. I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and one of the comments came up and says, we're not going to keep bailing them out. The unions had to take a small reduction in pension. Within the next year, they're going to take a fairly substantial reduction in pension. Here's what's going to happen in the next 6 months. Chicago's, well, actually probably the next 4. Chicago's going to go bankrupt. They went to the Supreme Court. The 4 unions disagreed out of the 28. The other 24 agreed to a settlement, and it was a fairly significant cutback in benefits, right? So then what happened was the 4 that did not went to Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against the city for the 4 unions, and they were required to raise property taxes in Chicago by 40%. It's bankrupting the very communities of poor people that they allegedly were attempting to help. Those people are then moving out of the city. So now we don't need those teachers anymore. We don't need that government infrastructure. That hasn't happened yet, by the way, but it will implode. Chicago's liability is about the same as Pennsylvania's is. If that happens, Illinois goes bankrupt. This Puerto Rico bankruptcy was designed to set the stage for when Illinois goes bankrupt, because constitutionally, a commonwealth cannot go into, or a state cannot go into a federal court and file bankruptcy. They're trying to give it a mechanism to either transfer the debt. I believe, as happened at the founding of the United States, the in-debt states will attempt to transfer their liabilities to the federal government under the perspective that debt doesn't matter. Well, let me tell you, it does matter, because all that's going to happen at the federal level, they have some. If you read a bill, a dollar currency, it says this is legal tender for all notes, public and private, and in the legislation it says backed by the general faith and credit of the United States government. The minute someone doesn't have that general faith and credit, it's no longer there, and it implodes. The Chinese have already gotten world currency status for the renminbi. And when that occurs, or RMB, I've heard of people pronounce it different ways. When you put all of those things together, this does not bode well for them not negotiating. Because by the time this happened, I remember the steel industry. The steel industry, nobody would do anything until Bethlehem Steel went bankrupt. The minimum Bethlehem Steel did, everybody found religion. We got to fix this mess. So I agree with you, but the one thing I would ask you is, as a personal favor, and my wife will disagree with what I'm about to say, I'm not one that likes to scream, and except the dogs when they do something. But when I look at doing things and negotiating, the more angry somebody else gets, the calmer I get. Because if I don't, I'll lose it for you, and you won't get anything. So that's my point. I was on the ethics committee for the Pennsylvania Institute of CPAs for 4 years, and we worked with a group called CPA Vision to change the professional standard for CPAs that says that we have to disclaim an audit if the system of internal controls is not, it's called the COSO standards, and I'm going to bore the tears out of it even more than I have been. It's called AU 314. That says the system of internal controls, the tone at the top is free and independent. That is automatically now, it's called whiplashing in Pennsylvania, and that is automatically a violation of system of internal controls. The IRS now has that on their forms that have to be filled out, so they would have to disclaim it. If they failed to do so, I've already notified the PICPA, and they said we knew it was coming because I just left their chair. I am filing the complaint as a member of the legislature should I be elected in November.